Hello, and welcome to this thing. Today I'm taking some choice comments I've seen on Twitter and talking about them for a little bit. I'm not going to name names because I don't think that the particular individuals making these arguments are relevant to anything I'll have to say about them, but if you hang out in similar circles, you'll likely know several examples of what I'm talking about off the top of your head. So this video is going to be about bizarre takes and some related statements about leftists, dog whistling, racism, a bunch of stuff like that. There's going to be some discussion of sensitive topics like political violence, terrorism, bigotry, things along those lines. So if that's not something that you're up for, go ahead and give yourself a break from this one. With all that stuff out of the way, here we go. Part 1. Leftist Rhetoric. One take in particular that I've seen parroted around online is the idea of leftist rhetoric being equivalent to, or at least reminiscent of, far-right rhetoric. As a slightly more specific example, I've seen people say that leftists saying things like kill all landlords is hard to distinguish from those on the far right talking about things like race wars or beating up Antifa members. On some level, these kinds of complaints about leftist rhetoric online kind of resonate with me. I'm personally not the biggest fan of violent rhetoric generally, but that's because I border on being a pacifist. Still, I can easily recognize a few crucial distinctions here. First, leftists don't commit violence on nearly the same scale in the name of their ideology as far-right extremists do. Far-left extremism, from what I can find, is a negligible concern compared to far-right extremism, which over the last decade has been responsible for 73% of extremist-related deaths in the United States. Another 23% were attributed to Islamic extremists, who any reasonable person could also identify as right-wing, but they aren't relevant to the specific types of far-right extremism that people are using as a basis for comparison between the left and right. The remaining percentage, according to the ADL, could not be categorized in those other groups, which does not mean that they were all far-left extremists, by the way, but for the sake of being charitable to this argument, we'll assume that they can be attributed to far-left ideological positions. Although, just to be clear, once again, that is not necessarily the case in reality. Now, if we are to assume that this remaining 3% represents far-left extremist violence, even though I would consider that level of violence to be bad, we can see that this issue is one of far smaller proportions than that of far-right extremist violence. If you don't trust the ADL's numbers on this, I welcome you to find numbers that suggest that far-left extremism is more dangerous, but unless these numbers start to become closer to 60-40, where the violence isn't completely equal, but around the same ballpark, then this argument will still mostly hold. The scale of the problem is not comparable. Also, if you want to pivot and talk about death tolls from states that represent certain ideologies, then feel free, but that's not particularly relevant to what we're talking about right now. Secondly, the ideological positions of the far left and far right aren't comparable. I'm hoping to make a video laying this out in more detail eventually, but the rhetoric of these positions does not make the substance of them any more similar. If we compare general tenets of far-left ideologies to general tenets of far-right ideologies, we can see a much clearer distinction. Again, if you want to argue about the failings of states in the past, that's a separate conversation. We're not talking about the historical attempts to implement these ideas, we're talking about the ideas themselves. Talking about both is interesting, but not helpful here. If we look at leftist ideologies, we see, in general, that they are against oppressive hierarchical institutions, and want to create more egalitarian institutions. This can be accomplished in a myriad of ways. Talk to a Marxist-Leninist, and you'll get a different answer than if you ask an anarchist. But this general opposition to at least certain oppressive hierarchical institutions is baked into most leftist ideology. There's also a heavy emphasis on systemic analysis and critique, focusing on the systems in a society rather than individual people. These two positions blend together into a generally pretty anti-capitalist stance, because leftists, when they analyze the capitalist system, see an oppressive hierarchical institution. If we look at far-right ideologies, there is often a heavy focus on individuals over systems. There's also a more hierarchical approach to social organization, with a sort of social Darwinist perspective. Right-wingers in general tend to believe that the strong survive and thrive, and as you go further to the right, this idea becomes more and more naturalized. Conservatives tend to focus on people's utility and ability, but if you go further right, Fascists tend to naturalize qualities like laziness or intelligence. Thus, the strong aren't strong based on merit, but based on innate qualities. And in the same way, the weak aren't weak because of their failures, but because their essence is weakness. This social Darwinist perspective, combined with an individualist focus and a hierarchical social organization, leads the far right to an inevitable conclusion that hierarchical organization should be defined along the lines of things like race, sex, ability, and purity. Far-right ideologies believe not just that the strong survive, but that the strong, in order to survive, must maintain dominance over the weak. Because they don't focus on how social structures contribute to problems, but individualize these problems instead, they inevitably scapegoat those who are weaker than they are. So we can see that the cores of these ideologies are not even remotely comparable. On the left, we have an opposition to oppressive social systems and a focus on systemic analysis and critique. And on the right, we have an individualist, social Darwinist perspective that naturalizes qualities related to strength and weakness. Now hold on there, bucko, you might be saying. We were talking about leftists saying stuff like kill all landlords, and now you're making it about these broad, wishy-washy ideas of oppression and hierarchy. Why are you trying to pivot away from that? Well, for one, please don't call me bucko, but also, while this might seem kind of unrelated, it's a necessary foundation for understanding why this statement, kill all landlords, is not equivalent to something like Thirdly, thanks to that super smooth segue, the ideas being expressed are not equivalent. Last I checked, every human, regardless of race, sex, ethnic background, gender identity, or political orientation, was equally capable of being a landlord or not being a landlord. If you are a landlord, you can choose to stop being one. Sure, that's probably not great for you. You probably make more money as a landlord than not. But you are still capable of giving that up if you want to. You can't choose to stop being black. You can't choose to stop being gay. You can't choose to stop being trans. You can't choose to stop being disabled. When people express the sentiment, kill all landlords, because I'm capable of being charitable to people's arguments, I can recognize that they're expressing frustration with the fact that we live in a system where people can own what is effectively your property. Landlords take large amounts of people's paychecks in exchange for occasional maintenance and handling things like utilities, but if you can't pay them, they kick you out onto the street. I know for some people, that sob story there won't do anything to change their minds about landlords as part of our system, but for those on the left, quite a few of whom happen to be relatively poor and live in rented accommodations, this aspect of the system provides a constant threat to their ability to live their lives. Whether or not you care, you should surely be able to sympathize with their frustration at this. Do I think they should be calling for people's deaths on Twitter? In my opinion, probably not. But honestly, I find it hard to blame them for it, and I recognize that their aim is not to kill people who are fundamentally awful people, but to eliminate a class of people who have made the choice to worsen people's lives. Does that make saying kill all landlords good? For those of you who haven't been paying attention, I don't think so, personally. Do I think it's an understandable frustration aimed at a group of people who made and continue to make choices that make people's lives harder? Yes. In the same way that people threaten to kill people who annoy them at work, or who always leave messes in the kitchen, or who keep forgetting to do their laundry. It's an expression of frustration, and as long as they don't start actually doing it, then I don't see a need to go out of my way to condemn it in the same fashion I condemn people who have an ideological opposition to people of other races. Part 2. Crypto-tankies. A related take I've seen thrown around a little is the idea of crypto-tankies, people who attempt to pass themselves off as reasonable, moderate people, but who secretly hold much more extreme authoritarian views, and defend the ideological purges of countries like the USSR. Now, that is almost definitely a thing. I haven't personally met a person like that or seen one, but that is a wholly unsurprising notion to me. However, the take I'm alluding to actually has more to do with rhetoric and imagery borrowed from the Soviet Union than actual positions espoused by these supposed crypto-tankies. The argument basically goes that, similar to alt-right and alt-light figures who have extremist far-right views that they couch in more moderate rhetoric and signal to their supporters with dog whistles, There are people who lean further to the left who utilize dog whistles to signal their support for authoritarianism and to veil their apologia for Stalin. The dog whistles that are being pointed to as evidence that one is a crypto-tankie is use of Soviet imagery and rhetoric, which is why I keep using the USSR as my example country. Now, if the internet was politically literate, I could just say that anarchists utilize these things as well, and that demonstrates that this is clearly a move to reclaim imagery associated with leftist views that was demonized during the Red Scare, but half the people watching this probably don't exactly know what an anarchist is or what they believe, so we'll walk through it a little slower. The USSR did some bad shit, like killed people, which is the only thing I should really have to list to demonstrate that. The USSR was also not communist in the way that people might think. Communism is usually used on the left to refer to a stateless, classless, moneyless society that's based on the idea of egalitarian social organization and the old standby from each according to their ability to each according to their need, to paraphrase. Now, calling the USSR communist runs into a problem there already, because anyone can see that the USSR had a state. There's a lot of background to lay out to fully explain this, but to reduce it to its most basic form, the USSR was an attempt to form a communist country that would be able to stave off outside influence and pressure, but ultimately did a pretty bad job of that for a lot of reasons. Now, if you're thinking I'm going off into unrelated territory again to distract from the argument, please have some patience, we'll get there. I wrote a whole script ahead of time, it's all planned out, just trust me. So the USSR wasn't exactly communist, even though it tried to be, but if you're not aware of that, it's likely at least in large part thanks to the Red Scare. The Red Scare was a propaganda campaign that sought to demonize communism and socialism in the United States, and other countries too, but I don't know much about the history outside of the US. You might have heard the name McCarthy before, as in McCarthyism. Joseph McCarthy was a US congressman who was on the front lines of this propaganda effort, creating lists of supposed communist sympathizers operating not just among the public, but within several government agencies like the FBI and the CIA. There's a whole dimension of this related to gay people and racial minorities that I don't have time to talk about in detail here, but basically these lists were an attempt to suppress leftist political activism in the US and also served as a proxy for targeting minorities without the bad PR of looking racist or homophobic. The Red Scare, as a propaganda campaign, didn't seek to educate Americans about the ideological pitfalls of leftist ideology, but instead, as the name suggests, scare people. Ideological nuances and distinctions were actually disadvantageous to creating an environment that was toxic for leftist ideology. So everything got kind of mixed and mashed into an amorphous blob of socialism/communism, where the only things Americans knew about communists were that they hated freedom and they killed millions of people. So what the hell does any of that have to do with use of imagery and terminology associated with the USSR? Well, having historical context in mind is always good regardless, but also, this excessive demonization of leftist ideology in America made use of these symbols attractive to countercultural movements. As an alternate example of this phenomenon, think about the use of satanic imagery among people who are critical of religious institutions. Satan is the unambiguously evil antagonist of God in the Bible, but the point of using imagery associated with him isn't to condone the suffering he is purported to have caused, or the evil he supposedly represents. The point is to demonstrate the break from cultural hegemony, to take up the symbol of the outsider and demand to be let in. This is what people are doing with terms like comrade and use of the Soviet flag. They're demonstrating that they want to depart from the current hegemony that liberalism has over our political environment. If you think that using those particular symbols in that way is bad or disrespectful or something, then that's a different argument than we were discussing. The argument we started with was people who utilize Soviet imagery and terminology are crypto-tankies, similar to how those on the far right using Nazi imagery are crypto-fascists. And, as I explained earlier, Soviet imagery is not used with the same intent or ideology behind it as Nazi imagery, either historically or now. Part 3. Leftist Ideology. There's a lot of general misunderstanding of leftist ideology online, but a particularly frustrating aspect of that misunderstanding is that people often have no distinction between different leftist ideological positions. They tend to all be very similar and rooted in similar values and analysis, but vary somewhat in priorities and approach. Take, for example, Marxist-Leninists. They tend to hold the position that a revolutionary vanguard needs to seize control of the state apparatus in order to achieve a communist society. The reasons for this are primarily as a response to outside pressure. More specifically, because they believe that a country moving toward communism is vulnerable to imperialist wars that would kill large portions of the population and prevent the country from reaching a point where they are stateless and classless. Contrast this with anarchism, an ideology predicated on skepticism toward hierarchical institutions and abolition of unjust hierarchies. Anarchism as a method of analysis is used in tandem with various other methods of analysis, but as its own political ideology, it seeks to abolish all coercive power structures possible. For them, the state is a big no-no, as it maintains a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence and is designed to serve the interests of a particular class. For them, this is the definition of a state, so therefore trying to make a state wouldn't make any sense. It's entirely contrary to the foundation of their ideology. They are okay with government, which they differentiate from a state, because governments are essentially just decision-making bodies, and anarchists seek to create governments with as little coercive power as possible. These two ideologies are both leftist ideologies, and both seek to achieve a classless, stateless society, i.e. communism, but their approach is pretty different. If you're arguing online, though, someone on Twitter could confuse these two ideologies for one another, since adherents of these ideologies would likely describe themselves, in brief, as communists. If you tried to say an anarchist was supporting the USSR, anyone who knows what anarchism is would be able to easily recognize the absurdity of that statement. The last Twitter take I'll share here is somewhat related to this. There's been an apparently ongoing Twitter argument about whether or not capitalism as a system is the cause of racism. One take I see from people who lean more liberal is that leftists blame capitalism for racism. Again, a little background is necessary here to understand my qualms with this. On the left, there is a vocal subset of very dumb dum-dums who make silly arguments saying that class is the only thing leftists should be concerned with. Class is the struggle that unites us all, regardless of race, sex, gender, ability, etc., so our focus should be on the abolition of class over all other issues. These people are referred to as class reductionists. They aren't too popular because telling people, hey, you know those struggles you face? Yeah, can you ignore those for a sec and focus on my problems? Thanks. Is shockingly a message that does not resonate with people who suffer from systemic racism, or transphobia, or ableism. Surprisingly enough, telling people to ignore issues that prevent them from living their lives freely is a bad strategy. There's an idea called intersectionality, which is basically the opposite of class reductionism. It attempts to analyze the struggles people face and the ways different systems of oppression interact with one another. For instance, if a poor, gay, black man is shot by a white police officer for shoplifting, there is a race element involved, but also a class element and an element of homophobia. Which one is to blame? Intersectionality attempts not to reduce it down to picking one explanation, and instead attempts to figure out how these various factors contribute to that particular situation. Most leftists I pay attention to tend to subscribe, at least to some degree, to intersectionality as a method of analysis. So that background was necessary to establish that the general case I see made by leftists is that capitalism doesn't necessarily cause racism, but that it exacerbates racism. So as an easy example, slavery makes sense to go to. Slavery was a popular thing because it allowed people to get free coerced labor. They didn't have to pay people to do work, and slave owners had no requirements for the conditions their slaves had to be kept in. From the perspective of a business owner, this is a golden opportunity. If people were presented with this kind of prospect today, I don't doubt that there would at least be a lot of discussion of it. This would allow a business to maximize its profits, so it makes sense as a business decision. Obviously, slavery wasn't a purely capitalist thing, but the point is that within that framework, slavery is far from illogical as a source for labor. There is a PR aspect to this, though, obviously. Today, slavery probably wouldn't become a thing in the United States again, because that idea is pretty unpopular here. But if racist ideology that specifically dehumanized and objectified racial minorities became a more permissible and pervasive thing, then the idea of using this large labor resource we just found on this new continent of Africa makes more sense to the average person. And obviously, if you own a business and have no conscience, then you would be incentivized to promote this racist garbage, because then you can buy slaves and use the free labor to make more money without worrying about your public image. Again, to be completely clear, this kind of incentive is not the only reason that racism is a thing. This example is attempting to illustrate that the profit motive can incentivize people to believe and promote racist garbage. Now, I don't blame anybody for getting confused here. People on the left in general have become especially sensitive to certain things thanks to dog whistling and denialism from people on the right. People of color on the left have had to deal with class reductionist bullshit way too often, and can't help but be wary of it. I also think that people haven't been doing the greatest job of presenting their case in this matter to those skeptical people. My concern is more that we're sort of having a debate where none actually exists. If there's a debate to be had about finer points, it's not really being had when people get stuck on that first question, which it seems like most people agree on. Does capitalism cause racism? No. Does that mean the conversation ends there? Also no. It feels to me like this sort of cynicism some of us may have developed might be permeating our perception of those who are aligned with us. For marginalized folks, that isn't something I can really criticize, because leftists are still pretty bad in some ways at discussing issues faced by marginalized people. I can't remember the last time I heard a popular leftist figure discuss issues related to trans men, for instance. I think the responsibility lies with leftists, especially those with platforms and privilege, to be more open to the concerns brought to us by marginalized members of our communities. Obviously, that doesn't solve the problem, because we need to design incentive structures and systems that encourage that, or, more preferably, ones that amplify those marginalized voices. But I'm an idiot, I don't know how the hell to do that. Part 4. Conclusion. If there's one common thread between each of these Twitter discourses, it's miscommunication. A large part of the problem with Twitter as a platform is that it encourages a certain performative approach to discussion that usually ends up leading to muddled discussions and miscommunicated points. Character limits certainly don't help, but the structure of the site encourages users to write things in catchy or inflammatory ways in order to get likes and retweets. Talking points do better than complex arguments. I find it difficult to be overly critical of people who give in to a system that is attempting to have them engage in a certain way, so instead of calling people dumb or saying they should try better, I'd encourage people in the short term to move to a platform that better accommodates the discussion they're attempting to have. If you're trying to dunk on someone, Twitter's not a bad place to do that. If you're trying to explain a nuanced position on the intersections of capitalist incentive structures and racist ideology, maybe talk in DMs or on Discord or on the phone, I don't know, wherever works best for the conversation. Preferably we'd redesign Twitter, but that's a little bit outside the scope of what we're capable of doing right now. Hey, this is the outro to this video, so if you don't care about outros, you can close the browser tab now. I wanted to say thank you to all the wonderful people who've subscribed to my channel. Gee golly, that's neat. I'm working on another video that's somewhat related to this one, just have some finishing touches to add, but I wanted to give myself an incentive to finish it ASAP rather than putting it off for a few more months, and releasing a new video is my way of doing that. I'm doing live streams sometimes, so if you want to hang out and talk for a bit about random stuff, you can follow me on Twitter at icon_comics to see when I'm streaming. I haven't picked a solid time block yet because my schedule is going to be radically different in just a few weeks, and I don't want to get into a routine only to break it a week or so later. It's weird, but it makes sense to me, so that's what I'm doing, and you can't do anything about it. I also have a Curious Cat where you can direct any questions you might have for me. I'm always happy to help clarify anything that you might need some help understanding. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and I hope you have a good day.